The coat came in on a Tuesday, the third week of February, with the frost still on the flagstones of Hartfield's rear courtyard, and the laundry fire doing its uncertain best against the cold. Cecily Marsh had been head laundress at Hartfield House for 2 years and 3 months, and she knew every garment that passed through her care the way a physician knows a patient's history. The weight of a fabric said something. The way a lining sat said something more. This coat, a heavy wool superfine in charcoal gray with velvet lapels, had been sent down from Lord Fontaine's rooms with a note pinned to the collar in the steward's hand, requesting that the back seam be let out by half an inch. The coat smelled of tobacco and the particular cologne the Lord favored, something with cedarwood in it that never quite came clean. Cecily had pressed 3 of his coats this season. She knew the smell the way she knew the sound of each lord's footstep in the corridor above the laundry ceiling. Specific, unavoidable, arriving without announcement. She set it on the pressing table and turned it inside out to examine the lining. The silk was cream-colored, a little yellowed near the armholes, and it was here along the left side seam below the pocket that she felt it. Not a lump, a stiffness. The silk too thick in one long strip, as though the seam had been doubled with an extra layer of interfacing, except that interfacing in a coat's side seam served no structural purpose she could name. She had scissors in her hand before she fully understood what she intended. She made a careful incision, 4 inches along the inner seam, and what she drew out was not a worn edge of padding, but a fold of paper, dense with writing, creased flat against the lining's inner face. She stood for a moment with the papers in her hand. Then she put them in her apron pocket, refolded the coat over the end of the pressing table, and finished the morning's work. Cecily Marsh was the daughter of a solicitor's clerk, who had been a solicitor himself before the circumstances of his debts caught up with his ambitions. Her father, Thomas Marsh, had educated her, as though she were a son he was preparing for the law, not because he had particular views about women and their capacities, but because he had no one else to teach and the habit of instruction was too strong in him to waste. He had taught her French and a little Latin, the principles of contract law, the logic of argument, and how to read closely. How to read closely, he said, was not the same as how to read. Any person with 2 eyes could read. Reading closely meant asking, at every sentence, what the author wished you to believe and what they wished you to overlook, and then looking hardest at what they wished you to overlook. He had died when she was 22, leaving her a shelf of books, 2 outstanding promissory notes that could not be collected, and no means of support except her own labor. She had sold the furniture in 3 days. She had kept the books and found work within a fortnight, and she had not wept over the furniture because there was nothing to be done about it, and weeping without action was a use of energy she could not afford. She had come to Hartfield House through Mrs. Pollitt, the housekeeper, who had known her father, and who had recognized in Cecily something the other applicants for the position had lacked, though she had never named it explicitly. Cecily suspected the quality in question was simply the willingness to work without complaint and the ability to manage figures correctly, combined with the additional quality of being able to tell when someone in authority was wrong without saying so in a way that made them feel accused. The laundry's accounts had been in a poor state when she arrived. They were not in a poor state anymore. Hartfield House was not a private residence in the ordinary sense. It served as a kind of superior townhouse, shared between a consortium of lordly families, whose primary estates were elsewhere used when Parliament was sitting, or the season required a London foothold. 3 lords in particular were its principal patrons. The first was Viscount Ashby, whose family had held the same Wiltshire estate since the reign of James I, and who moved through the world as though it had been arranged for his convenience sometime in the distant past, and he saw no reason to revise that arrangement. The Earl Cresswell, whose income from his northern collieries was the kind of wealth that required no defense, and therefore received none, all of it sitting in plain sight like a mountain, and Lord Fontaine, whose coat was currently folded over Cecily's pressing table with its lining. She knew these men the way a laundress knows any employer, by the state of their cuffs, by what they left in their pockets. She had retrieved from various garments over 2 years and 3 months, a total of 4 guineas in coin, 2 letters she returned unread, 1 set of gaming markers from a club she did not recognize, and 1 small penknife that she placed on the steward's table without comment. She knew which of these lords drank heavily, and which merely performed the appearance of drinking. She knew which of them spoke pleasantly to the footmen, and which addressed the air 6 inches above a servant's head. She knew which of them arrived in good humor, and which arrived with the compressed energy of a man who had spent his morning's ride rehearsing grievances, and was looking for something to direct them at. Lord Fontaine directed them at the footmen. The Earl Cresswell directed them at the cost of things. Viscount Ashby directed them at the political situation, which was his preferred target because it never answered back. There was a 4th man who used Hartfield occasionally, less often than the 3 great lords, whose name was Edmund Voss. Viscount Stern. He was 34 years old and had the manner of a man who had survived something, and was still in the process of deciding what to do with his survival. He was not loud. He did not perform his rank. When he passed through the hall and a maid dropped something, he waited while she picked it up before he continued walking, which was a thing most men of his station did not think to do. He asked questions with the interest of someone who actually wanted answers. He tipped his hat to the housekeeper. Cecily had first spoken to him a month prior, when she had returned a coat of his that had been relined in autumn, and she had refolded it incorrectly, seam side out. He had not reproached her. He had simply taken it from her hands, refolded it himself with quick, competent movements, and held it out for a moment before setting it on the hall table. In that moment, with the coat open and his hands at the collar, she had seen the breast pocket gap slightly, and inside it, a small oval object in a leather case, ivory and worn smooth at the edges. The portrait of a woman, she thought, though she saw only the case, and not the face within it. The leather was dark with handling. It had been opened many times. He had said, his voice even and without edge, "Do not unfold that again." Not the coat. She understood he meant the pocket. She nodded, and he left. And she did not think she had imagined the thing, the small flinch of something in his jaw before he turned away. That evening, alone in the laundry room, with the fire low, the rest of the house gone quiet, she read the papers she had found in Lord Fontaine's coat. She spread them on the pressing table, and weighted the corners with the small flat-irons, and looked at them in the candle's light. There were 3 separate sheets. The first 2 were letters. In a hand she did not recognize, though the hand was educated, the spelling consistent, the phrasing of a man who had done considerable writing. The 3rd sheet was different. It was a grid, 7 columns wide, the letters of the alphabet assigned in sequence to other letters in an arrangement she recognized immediately as a substitution cipher. Simple as ciphers went. Functional, rather than sophisticated. The kind of thing a man uses when he trusts the physical concealment to do most of the security work and does not want to trouble himself with anything more elaborate. She worked through the cipher on the back of a sheet of brown wrapping paper, letter by letter. It took her 40 minutes. When the text beneath the coded portions of the letters emerged, she read them through twice, very carefully, the way her father had taught her, asking at every line what the author wished her to believe and what they wished her to overlook. There was very little she was meant to overlook. The letters were not subtle documents. They detailed in the direct language of men who had never imagined that anyone with the capacity to decipher them would be positioned to read them. A correspondence between Lord Fontaine, Viscount Ashby, and the Earl Cresswell on one side, and an unnamed foreign correspondent on the other, identifiable only by a pressed seal in dark wax. An unfamiliar device, 3 interlocking rings above a ship. The letters contained dates, sums of money, and references to documents that had been passed. One letter contained a list of names that Cecily recognized as members of a parliamentary committee, whose work she had heard mentioned in the drawing-room above, in the context of certain legislation the Lords had found inconvenient. The nature of the arrangement was not stated in terms anyone could dispute. It was stated in the kind of careful indirection that men use when they know what they are doing is unlawful and wish to leave themselves room. Later, to claim they did not. There was no room. She could see that clearly. Her father had taught her what a self-serving construction looked like in a document, and she knew one when she read it. And she knew also when the self-serving construction had failed. She sat for a while in the dark with the papers in her lap and the candle burning down, and she thought about who she was and what she held and what the choices were. From where she stood, she thought of herself plainly. She was a laundress. I'm 24 years old. I earn £14 a year plus my room and meals, and I found these papers because a lord sent his coat to be altered without removing what was hidden in the lining, which was either careless or contemptuous, and both of those things together produced this moment, in which I am the only person in this house who knows what these letters say. She thought her father would know what to do. Her father was not here. She would have to know. Instead, she went to Viscount Stern the next morning, before the house woke properly. She had not considered going to anyone else. Lady Ashby's man would carry word to Lady Ashby before he drew his next breath. The household steward at Hartfield would protect the lords whose patronage sustained him. The magistrate's office was a theoretical recourse, but one that required a sponsor, a name that would open the door. She had no name except her own, and her own name opened nothing in that direction without help. She chose him because he was not one of the three, and because in 2 years of service she had watched him and he had watched her, and she had formed the considered opinion, based on evidence rather than feeling, that he possessed the quality her father had called discernment. Not cleverness, her father said. Cleverness was common. Discernment was the rarer thing. It meant knowing what a thing was when you looked at it directly, without the interference of what you wished it to be. She knocked at his private rooms on Hartfield's 3rd floor at 6:30 in the morning, before the other lords were stirring, and she stood with her hands folded, and her face composed and waited. He answered the door himself, in shirt sleeves and no cravat, his dark hair uncombed, and he looked at her for a moment without speaking. She held out the papers. I found these, she said, in the lining of Lord Fontaine's coat. He sent it down for alteration. I thought you should see them. He took them without touching her hand. He stood in the doorway and opened the first sheet, and she watched his face as he read. He was very still. The kind of stillness that is not blankness but the opposite of it. Everything gathered inward and controlled. The face of a man recognizing a landscape he has imagined from a description but never stood inside until now. Where did you find these? He said when he had read through the first 2 sheets. Not a question. The words flat and careful, like a man confirming a map against a landscape he already knows. In the left side seam, she said. Below the pocket. The lining was sewn double in a strip along that seam. The papers were folded inside the double layer. He looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing further. He stepped back from the doorway, looked down at the papers again, and then said, Thank you, Miss Marsh. She left. She did not know what he would do. If you have ever sat with a thing you were not certain was wisdom, and waited, then you know something of what the next 2 days were for Cecily. She went about her work. She pressed linen. She managed the accounts. She answered the questions Mrs. Pollett asked her about the linen inventory with the attention such questions deserved, and she kept her face smooth and her hands busy, and she did not permit herself to go back over the decision. On the second day she was in the main corridor near the east staircase when she heard Lady Ashby's voice from behind a partially closed sitting-room door. Lady Ashby was speaking to her steward in the low, decisive tones of a woman who has long been accustomed to having her assessments treated as verdicts. They will not act on a washerwoman's testimony, Lady Ashby said. Even if it comes to ears that matter, it will not go further. Cecily kept walking. She did not know then how specifically Lady Ashby knew. She would learn later, from Mrs. Pollett. That word had already begun to move through the house's upper regions, that something had been found, that one of the servants had found something, though the nature of the something was not yet articulated above the level of rumor. The house had not been alarmed. It had been, if anything, slightly contemptuous. On the 3rd morning, Lord Fontaine himself appeared at the laundry-room door. He was a large man with the particular ease of someone who had never once wondered whether he was welcome. He looked around the laundry as though appraising property. He was considering purchasing and finding it adequate, but unremarkable. He said, "My coat," and Cecily said without inflection, "It is ready, my lord," and she brought it to him. He took it without looking at her face. He held it up to examine the let-out seam and ran one thick finger along the new stitching, pressing into it as though testing whether the thread would hold. He said nothing further. He left. She stood very still after the door closed, and breathed through her nose and counted the stitches she could see from where she stood. The seam held. The seam had always been going to hold. The following afternoon, a footboy named Sam, 13 years old and small for his age, with the particular self-effacing quickness of a child who has learned to take up as little space as possible, broke a glass in the corridor outside the blue sitting room. Lord Fontaine was passing. The sound of what followed was audible from 2 rooms away. Not shouting precisely, but the cold, specific voice of a man who has decided that the breaking of a glass is a moral failing rather than an accident, and who intends to establish this distinction at length. Cecily recognized the voice. She had heard its particular register before, directed at other footmen, at a parlour-maid who had set a tray down too heavily, at the delivery boy who had brought the wrong bottle. The voice did not vary much. It was the voice of someone who had learned very early that certainty, carried in the vocal cords, was sufficient evidence of being right. Cecily came out of the linen room at the sound of Sam's voice, which was very small, and went to Mrs. Prawn. Pollet said quietly that she thought a glass had broken, and that she wondered if Mrs. Pollet had a moment. Mrs. Pollet, who understood such requests, and who had been managing the domestic consequences of certain lords' temperaments for 17 years, came at once. By the time they arrived in the corridor, Lord Fontaine had made his point and moved on, and Sam was on his knees gathering the pieces, his ears red and his hands not quite steady. Cecily knelt and gathered the larger pieces before he could cut himself on them. She wrapped them in the corner of her apron. She said nothing to him about it, because she knew that saying something kind to a child who is trying not to cry in front of 2 adults will frequently undo the effort entirely, and Sam was working very hard at holding himself together, and she respected that effort. Mrs. Pollet spoke to him briefly in a low, practical voice, confirming that the glass could be accounted for from the household fund, and that he should go back to his station. He went, his back very straight, in the manner of someone who is not going to let anyone see how much they are shaking. She did not know that he was in the corridor behind her until she stood and turned and nearly stepped into him. He was very still. He had been still for some time, she thought. Though she could not have said exactly why she thought so, he said nothing. He looked at the place where Sam had been, and then at the door Lord Fontaine had gone through, and then at Cecily, and something moved across his face that was not quite readable and not quite hidden. The jawline. The careful set of a man who is thinking something he is not going to say. He said, "Miss Marsh," and moved past her without another word, and she heard him go up the stairs toward his rooms, and she stood in the corridor with the broken glass wrapped in her apron. He had seen that. She did not know yet what he would do with it, or whether it mattered, or why she felt, standing in that empty corridor, that something had shifted slightly, like a hinge catching on its second revolution after a long time at rest. 2 days later, Viscount Stern returned to Hartfield House with a solicitor named Crabbe, a small, dry man with intelligent eyes and a leather satchel that he carried with both hands. They did not go to the Lords' sitting rooms. They asked Mrs. Pollet if she might be available, and Mrs. Pollet came downstairs with a look Cecily did not know how to read, and brought her to the rear parlor, where the 2 men were waiting. "Mr. Sevens," Crabbe explained, briefly and precisely, that the matter of the papers had been placed in the hands of a magistrate, and that her testimony as to the manner in which she had found them would be required. He told her the nature of the inquiry would be preliminary at first, and that she would be asked to give her account and be questioned on it. He said it in the neutral way of a man who has given this explanation many times, which was reassuring in one direction and alarming in another. She said she understood. Then, "Mr. Connerings," Crabbe stepped to the door to make a note on something, and for a moment she was alone with him. He stood at the window with his hands behind his back, looking at the courtyard. He was not looking at her. She had the impression this was deliberate, that he was giving her a moment in which she did not need to compose her face for his observation. She asked him if she was in danger. He turned from the window. He did not answer directly, which she noted. He said instead, "You did the right thing. That is not nothing." She looked at his hands, which were still, and at the slight tension across his jaw, and at the place where his right hand moved, briefly, to the lapel of his coat resting against the breast pocket. Not pressing it. Just resting. She said, without knowing quite why, she asked, "Who is the woman in the portrait?" He looked at her. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer, and she began to think about how she would arrange her face to receive that silence, and then he said, "My wife." He paused. He said her name was Dorothea. She died 2 years ago last November. He said it simply in the way people say the one true thing they have stopped trying to wrap in softer language, because the softer language no longer does what it was meant to do. "I am sorry," Cecily said. "She was ill for a long time," he said. "I did what I could, and it was not enough." He stopped. He said, "That is more than I usually say about it." The door opened. And Mr. Bratt. Crabbe came back in, and the moment closed, and they returned to the business of her testimony. She thought about it that night. Not about his words exactly. About the shape of what she now understood. A man had mortgaged everything he had left to buy more time for a dying woman, and the mortgage had not bought enough time, and then the man who held the note had used it. The constraint had not come from weakness. It had come from love made desperate, and she knew something about what desperate love made of a person's sense of available choices, because her father had stayed in a practice he should have left for 20 years because he had loved her mother's idea of their life, and it had cost him everything. Love doing its worst while meaning its best. She recognized the shape of it. The preliminary inquiry was held at the magistrate's chambers in the second week of March, in a room that smelled of damp plaster and old documents, with a low ceiling and 8 people present, not counting Cecily, who was the 9th. She gave her account clearly. She described finding the papers, the double layer in the seam, the cipher, and how she had worked through it. She was asked how she had been able to decipher it, and she said her father had been a solicitor's clerk and had taught her to read carefully. She did not elaborate. She answered every question with the same calm precision she brought to an account ledger, because the principle was the same in both. What was here, what was missing, what did not add up, and what, when you followed the numbers to their source, told you what had actually occurred. Viscount Ashby's solicitor was a man named Harward, with gray whiskers and the unshakable confidence of someone who believed the room was already on his side. He waited until she finished, and then he addressed the magistrate with deliberate politeness. The kind of politeness that is a form of dismissal. "My lord," he said, "the Viscount's freedom rests on this court's recognition that a washerwoman's testimony alone cannot constitute actionable evidence." The magistrate, a thin man named Quayle, looked at Harward for a moment, and then at Cecily, and said he would take the matter under review. Cecily looked at the table in front of her for a moment, and then she looked up and she kept her face exactly where she had put it. She had seen, at the inquiry's recess, Viscount Stearns step aside into a corridor with Viscount Ashby. The 2 men stood low-voiced against the wall, and she watched from across the anteroom as Ashby put a hand briefly on Edmund's shoulder in the manner of a man establishing a claim or reminding someone of a prior arrangement. Edmund's face was the face of carved stone. She read it from where she stood, and she could not read it, and she turned away. She walked home in the cold and did not stop to think about what it meant. That evening, Mrs. Paulet came to her room and sat down without being asked, which she never did. She said that Graves, Edmund's butler, had been in the tradesmen's quarter that afternoon, and that Lord Fontaine's household man had been saying things. She paused. She said, "He says it will come to nothing. That a washerwoman's testimony buys a lord neither inconvenience nor indigestion." Cecily sat with her hands in her lap. "Mrs. Pollitt said, I thought you should know what they're saying." "Yes," Cecily said. "Thank you, Mrs." Pollitt left, and Cecily sat for a long time in the dark, and thought about his face when Viscount Ashby put a hand on his shoulder, and about what the hand had meant, and about the 14 months between Dorothea's death and this week, and about all the things a man can tell himself are good reasons for staying still. She put out the candle and lay down, and did not permit herself to weep, because weeping required a privacy of feeling she could not afford to inhabit tonight. The formal inquiry was held 10 days later in a larger room, before the senior magistrate and 2 circuit justices, with 6 witnesses in attendance and a clerk who wrote everything down with the expressionless efficiency of a man paid by the word. Cecily arrived early. She sat in the gallery, not at the table, because no one had told her where to sit, and she chose the place from which she could see the room in its entirety. Viscount Stern arrived 12 minutes after she did. He had with him Mr. Crabbe and a document she had not seen before, contained in a sealed envelope that he presented to the magistrate before the formal session opened. She watched the exchange from the gallery. She watched the magistrate break the seal and read it, and watched his expression shift from procedural neutrality to something sharper and more alert. She watched one of the circuit justices lean sideways to look at the document in the magistrate's hand. When the session opened, she was called first. She gave her testimony again, with more questions this time, longer and more specific, the circuit justices methodical and interested, and addressing her as a witness rather than as an inconvenience. When she had finished, one of them asked her to confirm the approximate length of the papers, and she said approximately 14 inches, and he made a note. Then Edmund Voss was called. He was asked whether he had any direct knowledge of the papers and their contents. He said he did. He was asked to explain his knowledge, and he said that he had held, for 14 months, a sealed document sent to him by Lord Fontaine, which had been intended to compromise his neutrality in certain matters involving the group. He said the document contained a partial cipher key, and a list of names matching those in the papers Cecily had found. He said the document had been sent to him as what he could only describe as a gesture of inclusion, a message in plain terms that his name would be added to those lists if he proved uncooperative. He presented the document still in its original sealing wax to the clerk. He was asked whether he had given this document to the authorities prior to the discovery by Miss Marsh. He said he had not. He said he had found himself in a position of financial obligation to 3 men whose actions he had suspected but could not substantiate without that document alone, and that he had held it as a kind of insurance rather than as evidence, which was not, he acknowledged, the action of a man whose judgment had been unclouded. The room was quiet. Harwood began to speak, and was indicated to silence by the senior magistrate. He was then asked whether he could vouch for the account given by Miss Marsh as to the discovery of the papers. He did not hesitate. "Miss Marsh's word is the evidence," he said. "I will swear to it." The room was quiet for a beat longer than the proceedings required. Harwood did not rise again. One of the circuit justices wrote something, and passed the note to the magistrate, who read it and nodded. The proceeding continued for another hour. Cecily watched it from the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, and her breathing slow. The 3 lords were formally bound over for trial before the close of the session. The words were delivered by the senior magistrate without drama, in the manner of a man confirming what the documents had already established. The word scaffold was spoken once, afterward, in a low exchange between one of the circuit justices and the clerk, just audible from the gallery, used in the matter-of-fact way of those who deal regularly in such outcomes. Cecily heard it and sat with it. The men who had arranged their own ruin had arranged, over years, many other things, and what came to them now was the proceeding those arrangements had earned, and it was not hers to feel triumph or grief at it. She had told the truth of what she found. The rest belonged to processes larger than any one person's choices. When the room cleared, she sat for a moment alone in the gallery. She heard footsteps on the stairs. He came through the gallery door and stopped when he saw her. She stood. He crossed the room and stopped at a distance of about 4 feet, which was correct for the space and for what they were to each other at that moment. He said, I spoke to Ashby at the recess. He attempted to remind me of my debts and to suggest that they might be resolved through a different course of action than the one I was pursuing. I saw you speak with him, she said. I know, he said. I imagine what it looked like from where you stood. She did not answer. The estate mortgage has been voided, he said. The instrument was extorted under duress, which the court will formalize. Lincolnshire is mine again, without condition. A pause. She let it sit. He said, I am sorry I did not explain to you what I was doing. I should have known what it looked like from across the room. She said, You were protecting something. He said, I was protecting you. Ashby intended to offer me restitution in exchange for withdrawing my support of your testimony. I needed him to believe for 7 more minutes that I was considering it. He stopped. He said, I was not considering it. She looked at his face, which was the face of someone who had been carrying something at considerable cost for a very long time, and was now standing in the specific posture of a man who has set that thing down and does not yet know what to do with his own hands. She had seen that posture before, she realized. On the morning he had returned the coat, she had folded wrong. On the afternoon after the footboy in the broken glass, when he had passed her in the corridor with something moving behind his expression that she had not known how to name. She was naming it now. She said, Dorothea. He said, yes. She said, she would have told you to present the document sooner. Something moved across his face. Not grief, exactly. The thing that comes after grief has done its worst, and you are still standing, and the morning is still arriving, and you begin to understand that you are going to have to decide what to make of all the time that remains. Yes, he said. She would have. She was not afraid of the right thing. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. I have not been, recently, in a position to admire that quality sufficiently. She understood what he meant. She did not say so, because she did not think he needed her to say it. He had said it to her, and that was enough. And the space between them in the gallery held it quietly. He let that sit for a moment, and then he said, I am leaving for Lincolnshire in the fortnight. The house has been shut for 2 years, and it will want a great deal of attention. A pause. I wonder if you have ever seen Lincolnshire. She had not. She told him so. He nodded, once as though she had confirmed something he had needed confirmed, and said he would call on her before he left, and she said she would be at Hartfield until she was not, and he said he understood. And they went down the gallery stairs separately, because it was not yet the season for anything else, and because the gap between what was now possible and what had been possible yesterday required a little time to become real. The spring came slowly to Lincolnshire. It arrived in increments. First a line of green along the lower pastures, then the rooks back in the elms, then the kitchen garden showing its first gray-green rose under the warming soil, then the light at 7 in the morning, lasting long enough to read by. The house at Stern had been closed for 2 years, and it smelled of cold stone and old fires, and it was being coaxed back into itself room by room, which required a great deal of organized attention. The linen wanted washing. The household accounts wanted reviewing. The housekeeper who had kept the place in skeletal order during the 2-year absence was a capable woman named Mrs. Praw. Dowd and she and Cecily had taken to each other within the first 3 days with the quiet mutual recognition of 2 people who understand that a house functions on attention rather than on authority, and who are content to divide the attention sensibly. Cecily found that she was very good at organized attention. She had always known this. It was useful to find it was useful here in a place that was beginning to feel like somewhere, rather than like somewhere she was passing through. She had been at Stern 3 weeks when the morning came in clear and cold and gold, and she went out into the kitchen garden before breakfast, because the rooks were in the elms and the light was on the stone wall, and she had not been in a garden in a very long time, and there was no reason she could identify not to go. Edmund came out at 9:30 with 2 cups of tea. He was not dressed for riding, which she knew meant he had stayed in the house instead of going out to the north field as he usually did on Tuesdays. He crossed the kitchen garden path and stopped beside her. and she looked up from where she was kneeling. He held out one of the cups. She took off her second-best glove, which had soil on it, and she opened her hand, and he set the cup into her palm, and his fingers were warm against hers in the thin spring light, and neither of them moved for a moment, and the warmth was specific and deliberate, and both of them knew it. She did not speak. He did not speak either. The rooks were loud in the elms. The tea was hot. She held it in both hands, and the cold came off the stone wall beside her. And the garden smelled of turned earth and the beginning of things. There was a folded paper in his breast pocket, she knew, tucked behind the case with Dorothea's portrait, small and creased flat. She had put it there herself 2 weeks prior, when she had returned the cipher sheet to him after the court's formalities were concluded. He had folded it without ceremony and placed it there, in the same pocket, and she had watched him do it. And she had understood what it meant to him to carry both things in the same place. The thing that had cost him the most, and the thing that had unmade the cost. The rook settled in the elm above the garden wall. She thought of her father and his books on the shelf in the room that no longer existed, and she thought that he would have liked this, and then she thought that she did too. His hand was still warm where it had rested against hers, and the cup was warm, and the spring light moved across the stone wall with the unhurried patience of a morning that had nowhere else to be, and she let it be what it was, which was the beginning of the thing they had both been making their way toward, through all the long, cold months, without knowing they were allowed. If you stayed with Cecily to the end of her story, I am grateful for your company. Tonight you might leave a thought in the comment below, if the moment moves you. Whatever you carry with you from this, I hope it is something warm.